Hello everyone and welcome back to the third day of the second game of the Aimchess US Rapid Knockouts. It's Jan-Krzysztof Duda versus Magnus Carlsen, and like yesterday, Magnus started with a win, then the second game ended in a draw, and now we're gonna see what happens in the third game. It's quite an enjoyable one. It features two really awesome pause the video moments, so let's dive straight into it. Duda with the white pieces opens with c4. He goes for the English opening. Knight to f6 by Magnus, knight to c3, and now e5. So just the normal two knights variation of the English, and now g3 going for the Bremen system. We have bishop to b4, the Smyslov variation against this, and now knight to f3. We have e4 challenging this knight, and now knight to d4. We have knight to c6 challenging white's knight here, and now knight back to c2. Challenging the bishop here. We have bishop captures on c3, d captures on c3, kind of doubling white's pawns here, but at some point you will bring this knight over to d5, so it should not be a problem. We have h6 by Magnus, and now there is a game where knight to e3 was played, but here we have bishop to g2 by Duda, and it is now already, as of move 8, that we have a completely new game. Magnus continues with d6. He wants to develop his light square bishop. We have h3, and now b6. The bishop will be developed on this diagonal by fianchettoing it. We have knight to e3, and now comes bishop to b7. And now, as we mentioned, the knight is coming to d5. So knight to d5, if black should ever capture the knight, white will just nicely undouble his pawn. So here we have knight to e5 by Magnus, and now bishop to f4. Duda continues development. We have castles by Magnus, and now b3. So strengthening the c4 pawn here. We have rook to e8, and now bishop back to e3. The bishop can now be shifted to d4 at any moment if needed. We have a5, Magnus grabbing more space on the queen side, and now a4. And here, knight e to d7. So here, Magnus wants to shift the knight over to c5 to put pressure on b3, but also from c5 it will also be nicely defending the e4 pawn. So g4 by Duda, and now knight to c5 as planned. And now the question is, what do you do here? A very interesting line is b4. But it doesn't really offer Duda all that much. For example, if b4, we're going to capture the knight here, and after c captures, we're going to capture on b4, pawn captures, and now the knight will simply move and just, be shifted over to f6. If a5, we just play this, and black has sufficient control of the b6 square, not a problem, and the white doesn't really have anything here. So Duda doesn't just push, he plays rook to b1, and now Magnus captures on d5. We have knight captures on d5, c captures, and now f5, with the idea of, busting open the position here. He wants to go after the white king, but it doesn't really do you any good, because queen f6 is coming, rook e5 is coming, and you're not going to be able to keep this pawn. So instead we have queen to d2 by Duda, now maybe with ideas of pushing g5 here, but now we have rook to e5 by Magnus. So what do you do here? Well, if you try g5 now, then you just lose the d5 pawn. There's really no point in that. So Duda defends it. We have c4, and now queen to h4 by Magnus. And now there are a lot of pieces here around the black king. This pawn is very nasty. It can be pushed to f4. You can capture on g4. This rook is coming to f8, and Duda needs to figure out what to do with the king. One interesting idea is maybe king d1, king to c2, and just try and hide the king on the queen side. But Duda plays bishop to f4. He attacks the rook, rook to e7, and now king to f1. And it's an interesting decision going to the king side here, because there are so many pieces surrounding the white king here. And Magnus brings another one, rook to f8. We have g5 by Duda, trying to open up black's king side, but there is a move that really just makes life very, very difficult for white here. So this is the first pause the video moment. Pause the video and try to find this idea for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this elusive idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is pawn to e3. That's the good stuff. Not only does it attack the bishop here because the queen no longer defends the bishop, but it also frees up the e4 square for our knight, and that's the point. So what can you do here? If you capture with the f pawn, then we play h captures on g5, and then these two pawns are just too strong. Bishop moves, we're going to play f4, and now the rook is on f8. We're going to open up the position, and it's a game over for white. So Duda, of course, captures the pawn. We have bishop captures on e3 with the bishop, and now knight to e4 by Magnus. And again, what do you do here? The queen is attacked. The f2 pawn is also kind of attacked. And if you trade here, just bishop captures, we're gonna play queen captures on e4, and now there's an attack on both rooks here. So you're gonna have to give up one of them. So instead, we have queen to d3, and now comes f4. So challenging the bishop here. And now if you capture on e4, which seems like it's possible, just f captures on e3, and it's game over. The f2 pawn is now attacked 3 times, and also the bishop here is attacked twice. There's nothing white can do here. So after f4, we have bishop to d4 by Duda, and now knight captures on g5. The knight is attacked, so we simply capture here, and we prepare to further push, probably with f3. So Duda prevents this by pushing f3, but now look at this lonely bishop here. It's basically a pawn, and it's very difficult to really even imagine how this bishop or rook will ever see the light of day, or this rook, you know. For that matter. And now what does Magnus do? Well, he simply brings the only inactive piece into the game. It's his light square bishop on b7, and he now shifts it into the game with bishop to c8. And now the h3 pawn is attacked 3 times, and the white can't really add any more defenders. So here we have queen to d2. Now preparing queen to e1 to try and trade off the queens, and the Magnus simply captures it. Knight captures on h3. We have queen to e1, and now Magnus could play queen h5, for example, and keep the queens on the board. His position is, well, much better. This rook can come to e8. You're going to put additional pressure here, but he is already up 1 point in the match. If he gets a draw here, then Duda will not be able to win the match, even if he wins the final game. So he simply trades queens. We have queen captures, king captures, and now knight to g5. And here Magnus is up a pawn, but his position is much better. There's there's no easy way to activate this bishop. So here we have rook to h4. He's going to try and organize an attack on this pawn here. Maybe bishop to c3, rook to d1, bring the rook here, add another attacker. Maybe bishop to d2, attack the pawn from there. So maybe something in those lines. So bishop to f5 by Magnus, attacking the rook on b1, and Duda just lifts it with rook to b2. Now the c5 pawn is hanging, so Magnus brings the bishop back. And now king to f2. We have rook e to f7, now adding more defense here, and white really doesn't have any choices here. It's a position where you might be able to survive, but Duda needs a win here. So rook to d2, he's going to try and organize an attack against this f4 pawn, and now rook to e8 by Magnus. We have bishop to f1, but now knight to h7. We have bishop to c3. Like I said, he's trying to attack this pawn, but it doesn't matter. Knight to f8, and the knight is now coming to g6 with tempo. He's going to attack the rook and also add more defense to the f4 pawn. So rook to d4, but now just knight to g6. So now the rook has to go back. We have rook to h1. And now king to h7. So there's no way to make any progress here, and the rook is, has a firm grip on the e3 square with the pawn. You can't really push this pawn. It's just very difficult to even look at this. So bishop to d2, adding another attacker, but now rook e to f8. Magnus says, I'm very happy with my position here. You're going to have to try something. So bishop to g2, and now knight to e5. And now Magnus has some ideas of g5, g4, and, well, it's going to be very good for him. The knight controls g4, bishop controls g4, and the white can only wait and see what happens. So here we have rook back to a1. He wants to play b4 and then maybe a5 and try and open up the position on the queen side just to gain some activity. Magnus continues with his plan on the king side. We have g5, b4 now, captures, and now rook to a8, expecting a5. So Duda still plays it. He has no other moves, basically. We have b captures on a5, although here c5 is also just playable. It's very interesting why Magnus decided against this. Maybe it's just a move that you kind of miss, but here, for example, this captures, d captures on c6, knight captures, still attacks both the the rook and the bishop, and it doesn't seem like there's a good way to play this. Rook captures here, we're going to capture on b4, and that's just it. Okay, you can capture maybe on b6, have this pass pawn here, but it's still okay. Two pass pawns for a piece might be playable, but it's not enough to actually do something with this. But it's a rapid game, so no point in giving him any chances. Magnus captures on a5. We have rook captures on a5, rook captures, bishop captures, and then now we have c5. The c7 pawn is attacked, so you could just move the bishop and let the rook defend the pawn, but Magnus plays c5. He wants to get rid of any pawns here in the center of the board, and then he will just be up a pawn. So d captures on c6, en passant. Knight captures, attacking the rook. We have rook to d5, as the knight also attacks the bishop. So bishop to e6 now, forcing this trade, and now Duda doesn't really have a choice. Rook captures on d6, knight captures on a5, rook captures on e6, and knight captures on c4. And this is the resulting endgame. Rook and knight against rook and bishop, where Magnus is up a pawn. So there is no real chance for Duda here, other than if Magnus just blunders something. So bishop to h3. Activating the bishop. Now comes knight to e3, keeping an eye on that g4 square. So now we are even planning something like maybe h5, g4 in the future. So bishop to g4, keeping an eye on the h5 square, and now rook to a7. And now the problem is you could maybe hold this with just repeating with bishop to h3, because by playing rook to a7, Magnus is trying to get rook to a1, rook to f1 checkmate. So maybe just bishop to h3 and wait and see what black will do, and then we will see something like h5, rook e5 attacks the pawn, king g6 defense, maybe rook e6 check, king has to go back, rook e5 again, and then probably g4, but the resulting endgame will not be enough for black to win this. For example, captures, we're going to capture rook g5 check, king to f6, and now we're going to give up the rook here for the pawn and knight. Captures, captures, and captures, and now you get this endgame where Magnus is up the exchange, but the bishop and pawn are on light squares, and you can just, keep an eye on this pawn with something like this. Maybe this is a table-based win, but I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure it's a draw. But Duda needs a win, so he tries king to e1, but this runs into trouble. Magnus plays rook to a1 with check, king to d2, and now knight captures on g4. So now the g4 pawn will fall as well. F captures and rook to g1. There's no way to defend this pawn. King to d3, and Magnus grabs another pawn. So now he's up 2 pawns, but at least Duda avoided a draw. He's still hoping for something. King to e4, we have rook to g3 now, preparing rook to e3 check to, well, pick up the rook here. So king f5 and still rook to e3. The resulting endgame will be, of course, winning for Magnus. So rook to a6, and now rook captures on e2. And now again, it's completely lost, but the Duda has to try. King f6, maybe he somehow checkmates the black king. We have rook to e8 by Magnus, and now rook to a7 check. King to g8, rook to g7 with check, king h8, and now rook to f7, but now rook to g8. And Magnus is now ready to start pushing his passed pawns. We have king f5, but now king to sorry, not king, but now g4. And it doesn't matter if you capture this pawn, we're just going to continue pushing g3. There's no way to stop the pawn. So Duda instead goes rook to f6, tries to get this rook captures on h6 in, but now g3. He doesn't care about this pawn. So rook captures with check, king g7, and now rook to h1. Magnus continues with g2, everything with tempo, so you can even play f3 next to defend your passed pawn. Rook to g1, now comes f3, and there's no good defense here. We have king f4, and now, okay, you can't push it because this comes with check, and then you lose both pawns, but we have rook to f8 check, king to e3, and now king to g6. We have king to f2 by Duda, now comes king to g5. And now, what do you play? Duda tries rook to a1, but now king to g4. We have rook to a7, now rook to h8. Rook to g7 with check, now comes king h3, and here king to g1. So stopping the king from reaching the h2 square, but the problem is there is only one move that wins here for Magnus. So feel free to pause the video for the second time and try to find this idea while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not doing anything weird, like for example moving the rook somewhere. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is f2 with check. We have to sacrifice this pawn and then the game is over. But to show you why this is so, we're first going to try something like rook to a8 to deliver rook to a1 check and try and win the game this way. The problem is there's rook to g3 check. If we just sacrifice the rook like this, then we get a stalemate. Okay, Magnus still wins the match, but he doesn't win the game. And if you try running away with the king, then we play rook captures on f3, and that's it. We have sufficient resources to draw this game. So the only move that wins the game is the one that all of you found. That's f2 with check. We sacrifice a pawn. King captures on f2, and now rook to f8 check. Again, the only move. If you try something like king to h2, of course, rook captures on g2 just wins the pawn. So this is crucial. Rook to f8 check. Now king to g1 loses to rook f1 checkmate. So the king has to move, but after rook to f8 check, it was in this position on move 76 that Jan-Krzysztof Duda resigned the game, and Magnus Carlsen wins the entire match. So same as yesterday, first game ended by Magnus winning, then a draw, then Magnus won, and today it was exactly the same. First game win, second draw, Magnus wins the third, but only with the black pieces. So Magnus won both games with the black pieces, and here you resign because if you move the king, then comes rook to f1 with check, king to e2, and now just g1 queen. This is how we win this endgame. So captures, and of course it's very simple from here on out. So yeah, once again, after rook to f8 check, he resigned, and a very nice victory for Magnus. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We're gonna show other games from the match. Levon and Mamedyarov had some very nice games as well, and the other pairs also. And the winner of this match, who is Magnus, will face the winner of the match, Mamedyarov Aronyan, that we will also check out. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I would like to thank Seth Hansen, Jessica Rikavicius, Hayden Queenie, Aditya Parasarati, and Christoph Alexander Sopa for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this very nice event, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.